And I'd like to introduce to you now, live here from the Jewish Museum London, Dr. Bea Lewkowicz, who's a social anthropologist and oral historian and director of the AJR Refugee Voices Testimony Archive. And Bea will introduce the work of the AJR Refugee Voices Archive and highlight the stories of 3 Kindertransportee interviewees who had a strong connection to the liberal movement: Rabbi Harry Jacobi, Anne Kirk, and Bob Kirk, being me.
Hello,
Bea. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Sean, for inviting me to speak today. I'm particularly pleased to be here today because I gave an oral history training session to the Lily's Legacy team at the beginning of the project. And I'm so pleased to see how wonderfully the project has progressed and how it has created so many different outputs. Really, congratulations. In my allocated time today, I'd like to introduce you to the AJR Refugee Voices Archive and focus on the lives of 4 interviewees who are connected to liberal Judaism, and then show you a short extract of a film I made for the last Holocaust Memorial Day, Voices for a Better World. Recording, preserving, and educating were the 3 central pillars which inspired the foundation of the AJR Refugee Voices Archive in 2003, following the Continental Britain's exhibition here at the Jewish Museum in 2002. So I'm very happy to be back here where it sort of all started. When I made the film for our recreated Cosmo Cafe, which was on the ground floor of the museum, based on 16 interviews, we were surprised by the impact it had. One visitor wrote that watching the film was like walking through history. So soon after, we set out to create a filmed archive of interviews with survivors and refugees from Nazism. We wanted to document not only the Holocaust part of their lives, but their entire lives. Their childhoods, their neighborhoods, their experience of persecution, separation, emigration, and loss, but also their different journeys in the UK, in foster families, in domestic service, in internment camps, in boarding schools, in hostels, doing war work, joining the Pioneer Corps, the British Army or the Land Army, or in Hachshara centers, Zionist agricultural training centers. Wanted to give space to the interviewees to recall their parents and grandparents who often did not survive. But also we wanted them to reflect on their lives, their career choices, their families, and their identities. In the last section of the interviews, we filmed photographs and documents ranging from passport, exit document, school reports. You can see some of them here on the screen, birth certificates, diary entries, and letters from parents to their children, often very moving. On one occasion, we filmed an entry in an autograph book of Gertie Baruch, who came on the Kindertransport from Vienna as a 12-year-old. A teacher had written, in German, "Die Erinnerung ist ein Paradies, aus dem wir nicht vertrieben werden können. Memory is a paradise from which we cannot be banished." But so many of our interviewees were banished from their homeland, their memories came with them. The aim of our oral history interviews is to capture these memories, and I should say sometimes lack of memories due to trauma and age, as best as we can, which means that our interviewers try to listen as best as they can and ask sensitive questions. I'd like to stress here that it is not only for the purpose of illustrating history, but also for the purpose of acknowledging the lives of the refugees and survivors and giving them the space to narrate and reflect on their lives. For many families, the testimonies played an important part, and I just recently received an email from a grandson of an interviewee who thanked us that he could watch the interview of his grandmother as an adult because the grandmother had died when he was a young teenager. And he also is looking forward to sharing the testimony with his children. So the act of interviewing is important in itself, and I'm sometimes surprised that interviewees who've been interviewed at various points in their lives for many different projects get in touch with me and ask me for another interview. In the last 18 years, we've conducted 260 interviews, which amounts to roughly 1,400 hours of footage, and we've captured almost 3,800 photographs and documents. And I should say digitally. We don't collect anything ourselves, and we send them normally to the Wiener Library if people want to deposit something. The challenge of any oral history archive is how to make all this material accessible. And as we know, people will watch entire interviews, and sometimes the interview are 6 to 7 hours. The keys to accessing the refugee voice material are A, the interview transcript, and I'm happy to say we have transcribed all interviews, And B, the Refugee Voices website, which lets you search the interviewees in various ways. Next slide, please. It's actually the next one. Yeah. So the three basic ways to search for is by age. So, for example, we have 54 interviewees who were born before 1920. Our oldest interview was born in 1906. That means 54 interviews came to the UK. So I just said you can search the interviews by place of birth. There is a map. Not surprisingly, most people were 50 people, more than 50 from Berlin and more than 50 people from Vienna. And then you can look by place of residence at time of the interview. And the majority come from London and Manchester, but many other places. And in the last year, that's what I wanted to show you here, we have introduced a new page which lets you search by experience, pre-war, wartime in Britain, wartime elsewhere, and post-war. So if you go, this is just actually a screenshot from my phone. If you go to the advanced search, you can put in experience and it will get you to the interviewees who fall into that experience. And that's very useful if you're looking for a particular topic. For example, and this brings us to today, if you search for liberal Judaism relevant to our event, 3 interviewees will come up, Rabbi Harry Jacobi and Anne and Bob Kirk, whom some of you will know, and obviously, and they, you know them. So the problem with this search is that if the term was not what it does, it searches the summaries of our interviews. So if the search term was not used by the interviewer in the summary he or she wrote, it will not show up. In the future, it might be possible to search through all the transcripts, but at the moment that's not possible. So I have to say, I was very pleased that when I prepared this talk, that I stumbled on an interviewee who didn't come up through this search, whose father was a very important liberal rabbi in Offenbach, and his name was Rabbi Max Diener. I'd like to include the testimony of Bea Lewkowicz in my remarks today. So let us briefly look at the lives of the 4 interviewees who are connected with liberal Judaism. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as I said, the 4 are Harry Jacobi, Anne and Bob Kirk, and Bea Lewkowicz. Rabbi Jacobi, Anne and Bob Kirk came to the UK on a Kindertransport. Bea Lewkowicz was born in 1919 and came to the UK as a young adult. And here shows you the page on our website, and where you can see in light orange is the experience. So that gives you that gets you to other people who fall into that category, and you can do more research. Next slide, please. I'll start with Anne Kirk was born Hannah Kuhn in 1928 in Berlin, but was raised in Cologne, Cottbus in Berlin. Her father was a chiropodist, and I should say he trained as a chiropodist because he thought that it would be very useful in emigration, and an amateur cellist. Anne left for the UK on a Kindertransport in 1939, sailing on an SS Manhattan from Hamburg to Southampton. Following Rabbi Dr. Matuk, whose picture we saw just before, following his appeal to take in refugee children, 2 sisters, Millie and Sophie Levy, who were active in the Liberal Synagogue in St. John's Wood, came forward and offered Anne a place. And here is it on the right or on the left of my screen?
As you see it.
Okay, so on the right of my screen, you can see the 2 sisters with Anne. In contrast to many other kinder, Anne's parents corresponded with the sisters before her emigration, and Anne knew where she was going. She was first put in a boarding school where she was unhappy, but then joined Southampton High School. And here at the bottom, you see a picture of her arrival. It says 1939. And the others on the top is a picture with her parents and in her school at the bottom, and her passport. The sisters did not want Anne to go to university and sent her to secretarial college in case her parents survived and she needed to support them, which was sadly not the case. They were murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. Later, Anne studied at the London School of Printing and became a book editor. And with husband Bob, Anne has been an active Holocaust speaker, educator, and obviously very active in the liberal movement. Next slide, please. Okay. Bob Bob Kirk, born Rudolf Kirchheimer, was born 1925 in Hanover and came to the UK on a Kindertransport in 1939. After staying with the family for a short time, and then because he was taken by a family who had actually expected another boy, he was taken in and had liked it, they had a good time, but then eventually the other boy arrived and he had to leave. So he stayed in some hostels and was then evacuated with a Hampstead parochial school to Whipsnade until 41. And you can see pictures there on the right in Whipsnade. After war work in Dunstable, he joined the Royal Artillery and in April 45 was deployed as an interpreter at a prisoner of war camp in Yorkshire. His parents were transported to Riga in 1941 and perished there. In 1950, he married fellow Kindertransportee Anne, and they had 2 sons. Bob became very involved with the liberal Judaism in the UK, and together with Anne is also an active Holocaust speaker. And here, I don't want to comment in detail about the pictures, but this is what we film at the end of each interview. So sometimes we have a lot of photos. So luckily, in the case of Anne and Bob Kirk, and sometimes we don't have any photos, and sometimes just a few photos. And this is just a selection of the documents and photos we have. Next slide, please. Okay. So, Rabbi Harry Jacobi was born Heinz Martin Hirschberg in 1925 in Berlin. After Kristallnacht, an uncle in Weissmüller, who later facilitated his escape to the UK on the SS Bodegrafen on May 14, 1940. And I don't know whether some of you know about the SS Bodegrafen. It was the last Kindertransport which entered the UK, and really through the efforts, the amazing effort of Truus Weissmüller, who got the kids out from the orphanage and managed to get some buses to get them to the sea, to get them onto this boat. It's an amazing story, and there's a new film which is playing in the Jewish Film Festival called Truus Children, and I can really recommend it. Harry was fostered in Manchester, but as soon as he could, joined the Jewish Brigade and was stationed in Europe until 1947. And actually here the photo on the right, you see him, he was in a hostel in Manchester. He's there with the glasses on the right. So he also stayed briefly in a hostel. A meeting in Amsterdam with Rabbi Leo Beck was influential, and Harry was ordained as a liberal rabbi in 1961, serving from 1956 in synagogues in the UK as well as in Zurich, and for 10 years as the chair of the Liberal Judaism Rabbinic Board. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, Gabriele Jacobi, née Dienemann, was born 1919 in Ratibor. And you will see here the reason why I don't have any personal photos of her, because in her case, the interview was filmed in 2004. No photos were filmed. So what's interesting, in the actual photos is all about her father, but in the interview itself, the interviewer wasn't that interested in her father. So there is a sort of dissonance, and hence it's not in the summary. But the actual photos are all about her father. So her father, as I said, was a leading liberal rabbi. Together with Leo Beck, he headed the Rabbinical Association of Germany. The family moved to Offenbach shortly after Gabriele's birth, where her father became rabbi of the Offenbach Jewish community. In 1933, Rabbi Dienemann was arrested and sent to Osthofen concentration camp. And in 1935, and that brings me to the previous speaker, ordained the first female rabbi in Jewish history, Regina Jonas. So he was the person who ordained her, and we've seen the picture before. And I'm very sorry that, in the interview didn't ask more about this, because she mentioned this, but doesn't talk about it a lot, and it just gets passed by. So that shows that obviously the interest of the interviewer and the knowledge of the interview really impacts on the narrative of the interviewee. So preparations were made for Gabriele to come to England on a study permit in September 1937. And her mother came with her and went with her to Woburn House, which was there to help the refugees. And there's an interesting quote from an interview, which I'm going to read. She says, "I can still see my mother. What? My daughter, a washerwoman? Out of the question. And we never set foot again in Woburn House. But then, with the help of Lily Montague, we get the connection to this principle of the domestic home economics. It was then called domestic science. It's now Home Economics Training College for Teachers. And that's where she went. And her mother traveled back to Germany. And in fact, what is surprising is that Gabriele Jacobi traveled back to Germany twice more to visit her parents. And mind you, she came in 1937. The second time, she was refused entry because her passport didn't contain the J in it, because she had been already here, and they didn't allow her to get into Germany, which was difficult for her. She had little money and found herself in London without support. She then met Hans Gustav Jacobi, a German man 20 years older than her, who had come to the UK in 1930 and married him. Through marriage, she became British, and she was able to help her parents leave Germany after her father had been arrested for a second time and was sent to Buchenwald following Kristallnacht. Her parents stayed for 3 months with Lily Montague. And again, I don't have enough information, so it would be really interesting to find out more, because in the interview it looks that they really stayed with her in her flat apartment, I don't know. So would love to find out more. They stayed there for 3 months, and then in March 1939 emigrated to Palestine, where Rabbi Max Diedemann died within 2 or 3 weeks as a result of his imprisonment in Buchenwald. So he died in Palestine in 1939. Gabriele was instrumental in creating a successful design and technology department of what is now Luton University, and had an interesting career. And in 1999, the city of Offenbach named the street after her father, and there's a picture here. You can see that on the right, Max Diedemann Weg, which is apparently the park, and it's very close to the Regina Jonas Weg. So it's sort of a meeting ground in Offenbach. So by looking at the lives of Rabbi Jacobi, Anne and Bob Kirk, and Gabriele Jacobi, I hope I could illustrate just very quickly the enormous value of our interview collection. The interviews provide us with the detailed textures and layers of memory. Maybe next slide, just not relevant. Yeah, neither on. The interviews provide us with the detailed textures and layers of memories of a generation of men and women born between 1906 and 1945, who came to the UK as refugees or survivors. The lives of Rabbi Jacobi, Anne and Bob Kirk, and Gabriele Jacobi exemplify the difficulties faced by many kinder and young adults. And I should say, often we speak about the Kindertransportee as sort of one movement, but it was very different whether you were 14, 15, and then turned 16 very quickly, and mostly education was disrupted, or whether you were a younger child coming. So the frequent movement of the kinder in the early years of post-immigration is quite typical, in between foster families, hostels, farms, educational camps, schools, and boarding schools. And the disruption of education, especially for the older children, like Harry and Bob, also quite typical. And Gabriele's situation also illustrates the vulnerability of young adults in domestic jobs with a lack of support. And in the interview, you get the impression that, and that again links us to the previous speaker, that marriage, was an option to take because she really needed help and support. I'd like to think of each interview in itself as a small memorial, a memorial of words, gestures, images, and voices, which contains so much information. And at this point, we don't even know what future researchers are going to look for. I'm so glad today that I found Gabriele Jacobi's interview, which we had not highlighted so far and which was sort of buried in the archive. It is clear that liberal Judaism played an enormous part in the lives of Rabbi Jacobi, Anne and Bob Kirk, and that they played an important part in the liberal movement in the UK. And I hope that in the future we can look in more broader terms at the role of religion and religious affiliation among the Refugee Voices interviews in much more detail. And I should say that, before the interviews, we fill in a sort of biographical details form, and there is one category of synagogue membership. So it would be quite easy actually to look through the 250 biographical details for and find out what people's affiliation is at the time of the interview. So I'd like to finish today by showing you an excerpt of the film I made, Voices for a Better World, which focuses on the messages which many interviewers give at the end of the interview. I hope this will give you a small taste of the content of the 260 interviews in our collection. And I'd like to invite you to watch, listen, and engage with our interviews and to be inspired by the lives of the refugees and survivors who have given us their testimony in the last 18 years. Thank you.
Jewish refugees from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia fled to Britain before the outbreak of World War II to escape systematic persecution by the Nazi regime.
By 1939, about 60,000 refugees managed to emigrate to the UK on domestic service visas, transit visas, as unaccompanied children on the Kindertransportee, or through other forms of sponsorship. They were joined after 1945 by a small number of Jewish children and young adults who had survived the war in Nazi Europe, often without their family, in concentration camps, in hiding, or with false identities. Another wave of refugees, many of them Holocaust survivors, came to Britain from Hungary in 1956. Since 2002, the AJR Refugee Voices Archive has captured the testimony of more than 250 of these refugees and survivors. In these oral history interviews, the interviewees recall the stories of their families and their childhood homes in places like Berlin, Vienna, Prague, Krakow, Cologne, Frankfurt, Bamberg, Bratislava, Bonn, Budapest, Munich, Hamburg, and many more. They recall their life journeys and the many challenges they faced. They reflect on their often traumatic experiences of separation and displacement, and on their lives and achievements after the war. Some of the interviewees have been active Holocaust educators for many years. Some have never told their stories. Many interviewees who have given their testimony to the AJR Refugee Voices Archive are not alive anymore. This film captures the reflections, messages, and hopes of the refugees and survivors in the United Kingdom who wanted their words and voices to be heard, and who wanted future generations to reflect on the legacy of their testimonies.
My message would be, think of the past and don't let it become the future.
Some unpleasant things can happen to you, but how you deal with them is in your hands. How you deal with what is given to you, which may be beyond your control. How you deal with it is entirely up to you. And it's your life, it's your responsibility. That's what I would tell my kids. That's what I would tell my grandchildren. You can't have everything you want. Doesn't mean to say you can't dream. But accept reality courageously. Don't recoil. Don't step back. Say yes to life.
Have to learn to accept people as they are and respect the individual, not try to change them or treat them in a particular way because that's their station in life. doesn't work like that. Everybody's an individual. And it doesn't matter whether they actually agree with you on something or not. You have to interact and treat them as human beings. I think that's the basic building block of society. If you don't do that, then eventually you run into the sort of trouble that we did.
Well, it's always said we don't learn from history. I hope I've learned something from my own history, and I hope my children and grandchildren. I'm very proud, Whatever I've achieved, the greatest achievement is always to keep your family together and inspire them, Without, much trying hard, but I've managed to do that. They're following very much in liberal Jewish footsteps and teaching and practicing, which is very rare, even among the rabbinate nowadays. So my famous passages is the last passage in our Bible. The prophet Malachi says, the last sentence in our Bible says, Elijah will come and he will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents. So very often, even conducting funerals, I quoted that. If you do nothing else to cause Elijah to come or bring the messianic age nearer, you keep the family together.
Be very careful of any prejudice. Always treat everybody, of whatever their color, their culture, their faith, whatever, however different of somebody else is, if they're different from you, they are still a human being. You have just learn what happened in Hitler's Germany. Please, please learn from that. Just don't even begin to think of anybody else as the other.
To listen to what the likes of us have had to say, draw your own conclusions, but remember that this is not just a project about telling it, also be stories about gains that can be applied for a future which will create more stable, better lives and bring people together rather than separate them.
Extremely powerful, shall I say. And thank you for the presentation again, Bea. If you don't mind, if that's okay, we're just going to go straight to Barbara Warnock over. And obviously, I just wanted to add that Bob and Anne Kirk are, of course, part of Lily's Legacy too. And if you want to explore what they said in our project, please go to Lily's Legacy Project, the exhibition on the website. And we have also a wonderful tribute to Rabbi Harry Jacobi.